Hi. I've given this talk a couple of times before. One of them was in Ruby Melbourne meetup a few years ago. And a friend, Adam Rice, said, hey, I watched your talk that you've given, and it's actually quite relevant. I think you should submit that to RailsConf, to RubyConf. And I said, oh, right. Sure, maybe I will. And then I did, and it got accepted. So I asked Adam, hey, can you give me some feedback on things that I can improve? And he said, sure, he has some questions. So I'm going to include some of his questions in this talk. I also have changed the talk a bit, and I've created an app to make sure that all my examples actually work the way they do in Rails 7. But then I decided not to use slides instead of actually show you that on the app, because I just thought the slides will be clearer. So let's see how we go. In this talk, I'm going to jump between controllers and then move to looking at views and then models. So not so much MVC, like the other way around. And then also we'll look at a bit of request code as well. For this talk, I've created a small app. This is a domain. And a domain has a user, and the user has many addresses. The addresses could be a home address or a billing address. We also have an order that belongs to a customer, and an order can have many line items. So just to, we're going to use this very simple app to explain some of the concepts that I want to work with. But first of all, what are anti-patterns? So anti-patterns are common approaches to recurrent problems that ultimately prove to be ineffective. So it's a repeated pattern of action or a process or structure that initially appears to be beneficial, but ultimately doesn't work as well as we thought that it would. It has bad consequences and very low beneficial results. We also have what is refactoring. So refactoring, we think about that as changing the internals of the code without changing the external behavior of the code that we have. To be able to do that, we need to make sure that we have specs or tests in place to make sure that we're not adding more functionality, but actually changing what we have and making it better without changing what the end user sees. So I want to start with fat controllers. Now, fat controllers typically includes business logic that should probably live in a model or a different object in the database. Keeping that logic in the controller makes it harder to reuse and then harder to test all the aspects of that logic. Things that happens in fat controllers are overloading them with logic. It could be too many conditionals to decide what to do, what to render, or where to redirect us to. We might have spaghetti SQL queries that are way too long to select whatever models or objects that we want to get back. It might have adding extra parameters to URLs. So we are still using the same controller action, but adding params to decide what we need to do. Or it could be using non-standard actions in the controller. So let's have a look at a couple of those things. The first one, in our case, we have an orders controller, which I think is trying to do too much over here. So we are trying to decide if it's a cart, and then whether to convert it to an order or to stay with the same object. It's trying to cancel the payment processing. It's placing the order if it's not already placed. And then it's sending a confirmation. Now, this is just one example that I grabbed from a project that I used to work on. Now, this does way too much. And in the end, it also updates the session. And the last thing that I haven't mentioned, if we looked at the action name, it's called placed instead of usual REST actions that we can have. A better way of doing this one would be to actually in my case, like a better way to do it is either to move that business logic to either a presenter, a service object, or a model. In my case, I chose a service object, but you might as well also create a model that's called, for example, placed order, and move all that logic over there. And in this case, what I have in my model is I'm initializing that service object with an order, and then I call all the other actions that I want to do. Now, why is this better than what we have in the controller? So first of all, this is a much more appropriate place to have business logic. The second reason that this is better is because it's easier to test what's in this model versus testing it in a controller. It's also easier to reuse in the app, whereas when it's in the controller, we cannot reuse it in other places, in other controllers as well. So it's going to be a lot easier to write functional or unit tests for this object rather than in a controller. Now, in that case, if we look at the same controller again, what I did is I just instantiated a place order service object. I pass in the order, and I call on it. Some people, when they use service objects, they might use either a call or a perform or a run. I don't care which one you use, as long as you use that consistently throughout your app. So this is a much better way of dealing with too much business logic in your controllers. We can have another example. In this case, we have a user's controllers, and we have multiple problems in this controller. For example, we have, again, we have a non-standard action, one. We have a call that actually calls on user.all, which is a different problem that you might have, that very recommended not to do that. We have an issue that we have like if not nil, which we have double negatives, which is everybody always loves that, so very unnecessary. We have a couple of params that are being added to the URL to decide what we should do or should not do. We have then, that is unnecessary in Ruby. We have a very ugly way of constructing the flash notice message that people will get in the end. And basically, if you notice, this is what we usually do for an index action in a controller. But over here, it not only does that, it also resets the password for a specific user if you pass a user in, which is not really the right place for that. So a few problems. So the solution to fix those problems is, one, not to use extra params on the URLs, and to embrace REST. Now, as applications grow, RESTful controllers often take on some non-RESTful trappings. This situation should be avoided whenever possible, and it often makes sense to extract these extra non-RESTful actions into their own RESTful resource. So we're going to have a look at that. So in this case, we took all the things about password resets out of the index actions and left it as users controllers. We call the action index, which is a much more standard way of calling that. And instead of using user.all, we put a scope of that to say like just active users, or you can do a different scope to narrow down the number of records that you are sending back to the browser. And then we created a second controller that's called passwords resets controller. Now, this controller does not have a correlating model in the database, but it doesn't need to be. We don't have to match a controller to the models that we have in the database. And in this case, we have two actions, one for new, to display the form to enter a new password when you reset your passwords, and the create when you're creating a new password. And in this case, again, we're using a service object to reset password.new. We pass in the param, and we call to do whatever we want it to do. So it's a much neater option as opposed to if we look at a previous controller action, and then we get two much smaller ones that are much nicer. Spaghetti SQL queries, or very, very long queries. And I don't have a very long query here, but I was just trying to make a point. And in our case, the one that I'm talking about is this one. And it could be even worse. It could be not only in your controller, it could be in your view. Has anybody ever seen something like that in your view? I hope not. Yeah. A solution is to utilize active record queries much, much better. So in this case, I just grabbed that query and took it back into the model. If that query was much longer, I would suggest maybe creating query objects, which will handle all of the logic of what you're actually trying to return back to the user. Which will be slightly better. And then in a controller, we just actually call on that scope, which has a much more descriptive name to use. N+1 queries. N+1 queries are performance issues. They occur when Active Record executes a separate query for each one of the objects coming from the list of objects. So instead of using a single query to load all of them at once. So in this case, we are getting back the 5 most recent orders that we have, or any 5 orders that we have. In this case, we're not specifying an order. And then we are going through, looping through all the orders to try and get all the line items that they have and group them by name. Now, in this case, you see that we have the first query to load the orders, and then the 5 additional queries to load each one of the line items for each one of the orders. A much better way to handle that is actually to use eager loading in Rails. So in our case, the only change that we have from the last code to this code is this line over here that includes the line items. Now, actually, if I go back, Active Record's eager loading capability in Rails makes it possible to significantly reduce the number of queries when you specify in advance all the associations that are going to be loaded. Now, this can be done by calling includes or preload method on arrow, which is Active Record relations, on the objects that are being built. With includes, Active Record ensures that all of the specified associations are loaded using the minimum possible number of queries. Now, how do you identify N+ queries in your Rails app? So, and then, how do you protect against that? So there's a few things that you can do. The first one is using the bullet gem. It's a bit old, but it's still golden. It's great. And literally, their documentation says that it helps to kill N+1 queries and unset and unused eager loading, which I love using bullet gem. You also have in Rails now a built-in strict loading mode. So if you check the Rails guides on Active Records query and eager loading associations, and that will allow you to automatically detect and alert you of N+1 queries in your Rails app. A couple of other options that you have, you can use Rec Mini Profiler with the StackProf or with the StackProf gems to get flame charts and thus detect N+ queries. You can use SaaS products to track and monitor the performance of your application to identify those kind of queries. And the last one, go through your log files, which I don't think anybody has time to do that. So I highly recommend using the other options that we have. Moving on, I want to talk about knowing too much about your neighbor's neighbors. So if we are going back to our domain models that we have, to remind you, we have an address model that belongs to a user. We have a user that has many addresses and has many orders. And then we also specify in this case that a user will have a billing address. And in this case, we only choosing the first one of the addresses that we have. And then order belongs to a customer or user. Now, in a view, we might have something that look like that. So we grab the order, and because Rails allows us to do that, we can do order.customer.billingAddress.street. Now, this is a code smell, or an anti-pattern, and its name is called the law of Demeter. Or there's also a name of the principle of least knowledge, which is a design guideline. It requires us to only talk to our immediate friends, but not to talk to strangers. Now, why is this a problem? This is a problem because order should only know about itself and its most recent object that it interacts with. For order to know that a customer has an address and then a billing address, and that billing address has a street or a city, is too much knowledge, and it's coupling the objects too much. So ideally, we prefer not to have this situation in our code. We want to keep it to 1 degree of separation from us. Also, this makes it a lot harder to test, because if I want to test this page, I now have to create a user with an address that's a billing address that has all those attributes on it. A better way, before I go to a better way, usually we have a different problem here that some of those things might be nil. So if we validate that we have a customer, great, but what if the customer doesn't have a billing address? So one way to work around that is you might see in your views people use try. And in this case, let's try if there's a customer, and then let's try if the customer has a billing address, and then let's try if this one has a street. And that only removes the exceptions from the code. So you're not going to have a page that doesn't load, but this hides a lot of if conditionals in it. It's just, it doesn't look like an if conditionals, but it is. So one better way, I'm going to show a couple of ways to deal with that. One better way is use delegate in Rails. And in this example, a user is delegating the street, city, street, and postcode to their billing address. And then the order delegates the billing address and the billing city and all of those to a customer. This is slightly better, and the reason why this is slightly better is because in our code, we can now just do order.customername or order.billingstreet, which means if we want to test that view, we can stub out that method only without having to create all the other objects. So slightly better, but it's not great. One slightly better option is to use a presenter with a simple delegator. So in this case, I created an order presenter, and I'm defining all those relationships on it. You will need to instantiate that presenter, that order presenter, in your controller or in your controller to be able to access those extra methods in the view. So this is slightly more work, but it is a much better structure for your file. And then in our view, we can, again, just like before, we can just choose order.customername and address those attributes directly in the view without having to go through loops to get that information. But I've started talking before about why this is a problem. And the problem is because in Rails and in Ruby, it's very easy to end up in situations when we have a nil object, which lead us to getting exceptions to saying undefined method street for nil object. Now, to deal with that, my suggested is to use one way to deal with nil objects, you might see in your views that we have if order customer billing address is present, then show me the address. Otherwise, show something else. So your view is going to be littered with a lot of if-else conditionals, which is, again, logic in our views, which is not great. So there is a better way. So the better way that I prefer to use is the null object pattern. And in this case, I created a new model that is called null address. It lives in app models. And it pretty much takes all the other attributes that an address will have, but it returns canned responses to them. But this makes it a lot easier that in my, I'll need to instantiate it somewhere. So in my case, I went into user, and I'll go into billing address, and I do addresses, billing.first, and if that returns nil, then I instantiate my null address object in it, which means that in the view, I don't have to have my conditional of if-else. I can just call address.billing address, and I will always have an object that will always return something back to the view. A similar, oh, I lost my thing. A similar example that we probably have in most apps that we work on. When we have a logged in user, we have a current user, you might see if a current user, then say, hi, username. Otherwise, return guest, because we don't know who that is. We can use the same pattern in this example as well. So for example, one way of doing this is use OpenStruct. And in this case, I go into my application controller, and I try and find a user from whatever user ID I have in the session. But if I don't have a user ID in the session, then I can create an OpenStruct.new and give it the attribute of name, which is what I'm looking for in a user in the on the user in the view. I'm not a big fan of using OpenStruct too often. So sometimes, depends on the situation, but in this case, many times I would prefer to, and in the view, I can just do welcome current user.name and remove that conditional from my view. I actually prefer I prefer the null object class that I've used before. So in this case, I might have an app models guest.rb, and in this case, I will define whatever I want on a user, but in my case, I only need a name. I will need to instantiate that guest class somewhere, so I will do this in my application controller. So I'll either find a real user, I will do guest.new, which gives me in the view to use the same, like welcome current user.new, .name. Now, the problem with overloading the views with logic is that out-of-the-box Rails templating agent, ERB, is great to allow us to present dynamic content on the page. But if we're not careful, we will soon end up with a large view files that is a mix of HTML and Ruby, which can be really hard to manage. This can also lead to repetition and violation of the drive principle, don't repeat yourself. And the issues that we have could be including domain logic, so a lot of conditionals, that even just presentational logic can become complex. It can be hard to maintain the code that we have because we might have to repeat it in many places, and it's also very hard to test when it's such a mess in the views. So some of the ways that we can improve that is to use custom view helpers, which I'm not showing an example here, using presenters, which I showed one, I'm going to show another one in a second, or decorators of view models. Now, if presenters and decorators are very much similar. Presenter presents an object, and a decorator decorates it, adds some stuff on top of it to decorate it. It's a semantic difference, but in reality, they pretty much act the same way. View models are slightly different. What I look at view models is when you take a few objects together and you work with them to decide what you want to present to the view. So it's slightly different, but still very useful. And then also a good thing to check out is template inheritance and nested layout to, again, dry your views and make them a bit more manageable. I'm going to give an example of another presenter, just because why not? And this is a customer presenter, and you can see here that I'm including the action view helpers number helper because I want to it's hard to see. I want to format the phone number that they have with whatever format that I want to have. I also included for location an address presenter to format my location the way I want the way I want it to be in that specific way. You will notice here that I have separation of responsibility. So the address presenter will care about how I want to present my address, not the customer presenter. I can do the same thing with a phone number. Like if I wanted, I can create a presenter for a phone number that takes a number and a country code, and then display the phone number differently depending on the country that I'm in. So you can play around with the structure a lot better when they are in objects that are also easier to test because they are removed from the view. The next thing I want to talk about is local variables and strict locals and magic comments. So in this case, I have an example that I'm rendering a partial, and I am passing the order into the partial. And then in the view, I will, my orders partial, I have a local variable of order that I can use to present the order. Now, Mandy's not going to like me because I used an example of a div rather than a more meaningful HTML tag, but this is for the example. You can also use this following syntax, which is exactly the same, but I removed the partial. I removed the distinct call to the locals hash. It still works exactly the same way. Now, what are strict locals and magic comments? So this is, I'm not sure when this was introduced in Rails, but before I talk about that. So when we pass the hash of the order into the partial, we get a local assigns to actually access that order through. But one of the nice things that Rails introduced lately is you can add a magic comment to define the locals arguments that you want to pass in. So in this case, I say I always want to have order passed in to this partial. And if I don't pass that in, I will get an exception, an action view template error missing local order for this partial, which is actually quite cool. You can also add a default value in case you're not passing an order in, right in that magic comment. Moving on to models. I'm pretty sure people have heard the term of fat models and God objects, but just in case some people here haven't, Rails usually encourages us to use the MVC framework, so the models view controllers, and they usually push us to push a lot of things down into the model layer. And new programmers that start working with Rails do not realize that you don't have to match all your models exactly to your database tables. They can be separate. You can just create pure old Ruby objects instead, just like when we did with the guest, or I can't remember what other objects, or I suggested a placed order object. Now, when we talk about fat models or God objects, fat models are models that are just trying to do too much. And a God object is defined as a class that is usually huge and has too many responsibilities. It controls and oversees many different objects and effectively does everything in the applications. Now, most applications have two God objects. It's usually the user and whatever the business domain is. So in our case, it's a shop and a cart. So our God object will probably be the order, because everything evolves around placing an order in the app. The problems with fat models and God objects, that one, it violates a couple of the solid principles. It definitely violates the simple responsibility principle, and it violates the open and close, which you open for extensions but close for modification principle. It makes our code a lot more fragile because the code has to be updated frequently, so it goes through a lot of churn. But because it does so much, every small change that we do, we don't know what's the impact on the rest of the app is going to be. Like, where is it going to touch and change things that I haven't considered? It's a lot harder to test when everything is just thrown in one file. It damages performance because it touches so many things, so the garbage collector can't get rid of this object because everything keeps reaching for it. And it's harder to understand because there's so many things that's happening in the app that it increases our mental load and understanding and the complexity of the code in that file. So some things that we can do about that. So in our example here, we have an order class, and I included some methods on it, which really we don't care about the implementations of how to implement those one. But those methods, I don't think belong on the order class. Because what it does here, it converts the order to whatever other formats we want to work with. So a much better way to do is to possibly create an order converter class. And in this case, I will have all, if you'll see over here, I initialize it with the order, and then I do all the other things that I want to do, that I want to convert the files in. And then in our order controller, I'm delegating all those methods to our converter instead. Now, if you noticed before, when I had place order service object, I usually use for service object verbs. So I do place order, invite user, welcome something else, like an action that I'm doing. Whereas in app models, I will use the noun version of that action. So in this case, I'm using an order converter instead. Callbacks is a favorite of mine. So callbacks are hooks into the lifecycle of an active record object that allows you to trigger logic before or after, or sometimes around, an alteration of that object state. So, so things like before save, or after save, or before initialize, and all those things. And they make it's really easy to do things like after create, after create of an order, then notify the person that the order has been placed. And that seems simple enough. It's so easy to do. The problem with this is that this happens every time you create a new object. So it happens when you create an order object in your tests. It happens if you accidentally did this on staging and suddenly send emails to a bunch of users because of that. A much better way, instead of using, and obviously, actually, if you go back to callbacks, there's some things with callbacks that I don't mind. And I will keep callbacks if it's something to do around my object, not touching other objects and not sending things out of external services or sending emails or so on. So I can still use callbacks for some things, but I'm being very picky and selective when I use them. But a better solution is to use observers or service objects. So in this case, again, we talked about using action names. So I use, in app services, I have a complete order. And I initialize the order with the params. And then in this case, I created a class method that's called call that I pass the order. All that method does, it initializes this class and call an instance method with the same name. And the instance method, what it does if the order save, then send an email. And in the end, I return the order object as well. And the reason why I return the object order in the end is because when it comes back to the controller, I want it, if it didn't save, I want to get the object back with all the errors that it had on it. So the controller can send those errors back to the user. So where was I? I'm going backwards, not going forward. Yep, so I was here, and then in my controller, I will actually initialize the complete order.call and pass it the params that I want. Cool. I've got 2 more things to say. I'll go really quickly. I've got a different question from Adam that was around when breaking apart a class that has too many responsibilities, what are the pros and cons of pure old Ruby objects with delegation versus concerns? So I went back to a project that I've done many years ago to grab this example. So those are all mix-ins or concerns that have been mixed into the user class. And as you can see here, like the user class that I have now with all those mix-ins has already 360 lines of code. Now those mix-ins hide so much more code in it that is hidden away, but my class is shorter, so this is great, and I can reuse the code in the concerns with other ones, so this is great as well. But the problem with this one, the problem with this structure is that, one, you cannot test all the code that's hiding in all those mix-ins individually. You have to test it through the user model in your spec. So it makes testing that a lot harder. And then the other problem is that, again, it's just hiding away, and there is a problem with looking up methods in the DOM object in Ruby, different problems with mix-ins. So ideally, I would not use a concern if I can avoid that generally. Last question is, if you delegate, do you test that the delegation exists or only test the class that it's delegated to? So I check the logic on the classes that I create separately. So I will check if the logic works on the service object. Or I will check that the logic is correct on my presenter. And then in this class, I will check the delegation actually happened, rather than to check that the other class did what it's supposed to be do, because I trust the other class to do what it's supposed to be do, and I just test for the message to be sent out. I'm going to go through this really quickly. Sluggish services that block in calls to external services. The problems with that, well, obviously, it makes the service slower. So things that we can do is move tasks to background jobs or set timeout. So in my example here, I changed the timeout from the default of 60 seconds to 3. And I'm giving a couple of examples using Faraday and http.rb on how to change the readout time on the HTTP object to take a value that is the number of the second of the timeout. And my last example is failure to respond. So in this case, if we work with APIs and we're returning an object, and if the order did not save, we're returning the orders. But the problem here that the client that is taking that request back needs to dig in and find out if really the object saved or didn't save. So a much better option is to add a status option that it's very easy to check, yes, it was created, or no, it wasn't processed properly. So in summary, I've worked through controllers, views, models, and requests. And my main thing here to remember is to keep your classes small, like follow the single responsibility principles. Keep your objects small so it's easier to test and it is easier to work with. And obviously, if you are refactoring your code, make sure you have tests. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.